Welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Welcome back to Note Doctors. We're so pleased you've joined us. We have had over 1,000 downloads in February and in March, so we're so pleased with the people who have found this podcast and are listening to it. And if you ever have comments or questions or ideas for a future episode or a future guest, reach out to us. You can find us on Facebook. We love to hear from you. And so, Ben, tell us a little bit about our guest for today.
Richard Desinord is a music theory professor at Howard University and is currently finishing a PhD in theory at the Eastman School of Music. His research interests include harmony and neo-soul and contemporary gospel, the music of Robert Glasper, pedagogy, and the visualization of music theory. One of his personal and professional goals is to make music theory more accessible to and inclusive of people of color.
I feel like the more sinister thing that happens when we start to exclude people from this, or we look at people as if they aren't capable or smart enough, because that's basically what they're saying a lot of times, that music theory is on this pedestal, and if you can't do it, then the music isn't sophisticated or something. What happens is, beyond that being wrong, is that people in these very same communities, because I've heard this when I was a student at Howard, is like, music theory isn't for us, that we aren't capable of doing that. And when those very same communities start to believe these stereotypes, I believe that's the worst part, because you can solve all the problems and get these people out of these positions of power and do everything, but if a whole contingent of people believe that their whole cultural group isn't smart enough or worthy enough of this sort of study or to be able to do something on this level, that to me is probably the worst part of most of that stuff. So trying to shift that narrative and bring more people into the fray when it comes not just to the examples we give, but the people who's teaching the stuff, the types of music we study, everything is super important.
So today, our very special guest is Richard Desinord. We are so happy for you to be on our podcast. And we like to just kind of open up asking our guests a little bit about how they got into music theory. You know, how did you end up in this field? You know, if you were to go back in time and tell your 10-year-old self, you know, Richard, you're going to grow up to be a music theorist. You know, what would 10-year-old Richard say to that?
Well, seeing as how 10 years old is probably maybe a couple years before I decided I liked theory and I wanted to do it. It's not that far off, because I decided to do it in 7th grade. But I would say, if anything,
Really?
yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
I always liked, I found something in my parents' house where I was writing all of my scales and like 1, 4, 5 progressions and stuff in 7th grade. It was just something, because it was my private lesson teacher on the trumpet. He was in the Marine Band. He was teaching me scales, things you'll learn in a regular studio class or something. But what he would do is, instead of just saying, okay, here's an F major scale this week, here's a B flat major scale, after he gave me the first one, he gave me the first note to each of the other ones and said, okay, figure out the patterns. And I had to figure out like the whole step, half step thing and do all of that. And from then on, it was just like, wait, like this is everywhere. Like if I build this chord or I invert it, this chord is found, like a C major chord can be found in the key of F, and this roll changes, and it's just all this stuff like that. And I've always been a nerd with that sort of like numerology, like numbers stuff. So the fact that this was happening in music, it was just, yeah, it was something that I found to be special. And yeah, so if a 10-year-old me would just say, hurry up, that's it.
Let's get to the good stuff.
Yeah, get to 7th grade already.
So you went on to Howard University, but you got a degree in music education.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
So a lot of schools don't really offer music theory degrees. I mean, period, but especially on a bachelor's level. But you know, I'm basically from the D.C. area. I grew up in D.C. and Maryland, and you know, went back to Howard for school. And yeah, I went to Howard, and I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I knew that was first and foremost. And when I started to tell people, I told my advisor with music theory, not technically official advisor, but hey, I wanted to study music theory, and he told me what I had to do, and I want to teach in college and everything. He said, get experience teaching in the grade school system, do something like that. It'll be a worthwhile experience. And I knew I wanted to teach, period. So went ahead and did the music education thing, and yeah, that's how I ended up at Howard with that.
Well, it's funny. Both Jenn and Ben have bachelor's degrees in music ed. And so, and I don't know, varying degrees of success in student teaching. I don't know. I know, Jenn, that was not the best experience for you.
It went well, but I didn't love it. I was pretty unhappy, even though I had a really good experience and a great cooperating teacher. But I just knew it was not the right age group for me. And I also knew conducting is just like not my thing, which is strange. Lots of musicians really love conducting, and I just didn't. And so, I knew it was not, I loved being in the classroom, but being in front of a middle school band, less so. So, but music ed was it was a great place to start, a great way to get going in this field. Go for it, Ben.
I was just going to mention that I actually overlap a little bit with your story as far as studying with a military band trumpet player. That kind of sparked my deeper interest in music. Like, I started studying with one of the U.S. Army Field Band trumpet players when I was in 9th grade. And, I loved it. I never realized there was so much to it, so much depth to music and artistry until that point. So you were definitely ahead of me 7th grade, no doubt about that. But I did grow up in Maryland as well, just like you. So, a lot of my family lives and works in DC, so pretty cool.
The area is deep with musicians and different ensembles. It's really rich with a lot of different traditions, not just classical, where you have all the military bands. You have the top ones, you have the sort of lower, I don't want to say lower tier, but the ones that aren't like the Marine, the Pershing Zone and all that other stuff like that, President's Zone and everything. So yeah, there's a lot of knowledge going around the area.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so we kind of got you on here because we heard your presentation on R&B, Neo-Soul, and music theory presented a few weeks ago, and I'm going to admit that I was drawn to it because I really love that type of, I like Robert Glasper, I love Corey Henry, I love those chords, and I was really interested in how those harmonies worked a few years ago. And of course I went to YouTube and I found some video. It's called playing dirty chords. That was like dirty chords. I'm like, okay, I'm going to learn this. And it was a guy with a keyboard with an animation with the keys, and he was playing some kind of looping progression. And what is even happening?
Was that Pretty Simple Music, the green? What was it?
Yes, it was green.
Pretty simple music.
Yeah. And so I'm like, what's happening here? And I couldn't really understand what he was doing. So I actually would pause the video, notate out the chords that I was reading on the keyboard, so I could go back and analyze. All right, so what kind of a substitution? What's happening there? And actually found the Sibelius file yesterday when I was rummaging through. I was trying to learn all of these progressions and understand what was going on. And really, I didn't understand most of it, and so what's happening here? I know theory, and it's just this. Is he just mashing chords down? I don't know. But your presentation was so thoughtful and illuminating for me because I'm like, okay, now I'm starting to see. And again, it's because I'm working from a framework, and you were able to connect with the framework that I was kind of aware of, and we'll talk about kind of hopefully a little bit about frameworks and how appropriate is it to try to put other frameworks on, or how to take music at its own terms. But I really enjoyed that presentation because it kind of started to allow me to make sense of some of these progressions. So maybe give us your elevator pitch on what that presentation was about, and we'll kind of dive into it.
Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, the music theory world has been undergoing sort of like a reckoning, as with a lot of other public institutions, where we are starting to see that we've been having this like a skewed view of how music works. At least we've been presented it that way. A student comes into an institution, whether it's conservatory or public college or even grade school, and you learn music theory through this lens of basically Western classical music. So that was always something when I started grad school. You know, I remember the first semester I had a bibliography class, and it was like, go out and find a bunch of information on something. And I remember even prior to getting to Penn State for my master's, I was like, okay, I want to learn about Mahler. And then I started looking up a bunch of stuff about Mahler, and I started noticing it was this guy that they would call the Black Mahler, who was Samuel Coleridge Taylor. And I started wondering, why have I never heard of him? Why have I never seen him in these books? And I started to look him up, and I looked in like the Taruscan, like the big volume that he has, and like a couple of different other books, and he was never mentioned. So for me, it was just this general idea, like fast forward, the more and more I taught in college, because this was fall 2014, I started to notice more and more examples that I was using was basically just falling on down the line of just European male composers all the time. And if you know, you might see a Duke Ellington example or some Scott Joplin piece once in the textbook, but never really coming out. And the students, no matter what their race or background was, they don't just listen to classical music. They listen to a bunch of other things. And so I was thinking about the fact that I listened to this stuff. I grew up around this sort of music. My parents are Haitian, so by extension, I'm Haitian too. And there's a lot of Caribbean music out there. There's a bunch of things that is just like, these things would probably fall in line with like a tonal sort of framework. And so my friends that do Classically Black podcasts, Katie Brown, Delaney Harris, they said with the organization that they started, the International Society of Black Musicians, they wanted me to just talk. And I said, okay, I'll just talk about some R&B and Neo-Soul. And yeah, I thought it was just an informal sort of thing, like come and talk, because we've done little get-togethers, happy hour sort of things over Zoom. I thought nothing of it, and I put some things together, and my best friend got wind of it, and then she plastered my face everywhere. That's the disclaimer. I don't have any social media. I have none. My online presence is literally an email address. So
good for you.
And I've never used any
Impressive.
of it. I've never tried anything like that. So it got to a point where they would, put it out everywhere, and and then I started. I said, okay, maybe it's going to be a little bit more, maybe 5 extra people, but let me just try to put more. And as I started going through more and more music, I started to think about the fact that I'm teaching a lot of this stuff. Some of those examples were from things I've put in assignments in the past, but I teach at an HBCU, and I got to think about the fact that these students are listening to musics that sometimes embody this sort of Western classical tradition, the Western classical traditions, or they might listen to something that's tonal, but what if it doesn't fall along the lines of 5/1? What if it doesn't have that phrase model? How do I explain it to them? And we start going through these things. So yeah, a lot of it was me just trying to make sure that these students that they saw themselves in it. Because I'll end with at least this question with this. Someone asked me a few years ago, what would I say to someone who is trying to get into music theory and get into a school for music theory? And I couldn't really make the case for it, not because my school sucked or something like that, but it was more so that I feel like I'm more of an anomaly. Like, I didn't grow up around classical music. I didn't grow up having someone push it down my throat. It was just something that I liked. And because I also have some limited dexterity with R&B and Neo-Soul, and I'm able to figure out from both standpoints, someone who knows no classical music, someone who, or classical theory, formal theory, somebody who knows it, and trying to like bridge that divide and have it be more of a communal sort of thing, like everybody can participate rather than, if you understand theory, you don't understand, the jazz things or R&B or soul or anything else like that.
I was thinking about Coleridge Taylor. I do a little unit on him in my 20th century class. or my advanced analysis. It's one of the two, like upper level music theory kind of classes. And when I first started to work with his music, sometimes I had trouble finding the scores or finding scores that were notated or finding good recordings. And that's the kind of, that's, you know, one of the basic things we need to fix right there. Like, that's one of the things, like, there's so much inequality. It's like you don't know where to start. But when we're trying to use this music, it's apparent immediately. The distinctions there. And his music is incredible. And there's so much in it that is fascinating and interesting to study. And so it makes you think, like, why are orchestras not playing this music all the time? Just like Mahler.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a, you know, it's a great, it's, yeah, there's a reckoning that still needs to be happening. And I'm glad it's a conversation we're finally having in our field. It's been a long time coming, I think. Yeah. Can you help us with like some of the distinctions in these terms, R&B, Neo-Soul, some things like that? And you mentioned that the kind of the 5-1 model maybe doesn't work that well. What's a better starting place?
Okay, so at least to the first part, I don't even think Neo-Soul artists know if there's a distinction. I feel like there's like this big umbrella, right, of artists in the R&B tradition. And it's just like hip hop, and then there's trap music, or there's gangster rap. There's all these different things. There's pop rap, everything. But those are easier to parse out, right? You can hear something that if someone says, okay, this is a trap artist or this is a trap beat, you can kind of hear it. It sounds a certain way. Or like if you listen to rock and like it's grunge or metal, you can hear these things. With Neo-Soul, the things that so far that I've been able to pinpoint within Neo-Soul music is that there's a certain level of intimacy when it comes to chord progressions, not even just like intimacy with regard to lyrics, but chord progressions in the way they're voiced and the way they're played. So a lot of times you have upper extensions, upper extension 9s, 11s, 13s on chords. And then in addition to that, a lot of times that it's not just a loop of the same thing throughout the entire song. There, you can tell that somebody is like playing that, even if they loop maybe 4 bars instead of 1. But there's a little bit, it's a little bit looser in terms of the harmonic structure. Sometimes you have a composer, they'll put in like a little extra thing in there. I'm going to actually, let me see if I can.
Yeah, if you have your keyboard, I think it probably will come through.
I think
maybe.
So. You guys tell me. Can you hear this? Okay, cool. So what they'll maybe do is, let's say it's just a 2-chord progression, and they're just doing something like if that's classical, you'll hear this 1, 4, 1. It just keeps doing that over and over. So instead of just doing that same thing over and over again, you might have them play and voice it. And then they keep doing that sort of thing. And you'll hear it, the way they voice the chord and play it and inflect it is shifted a lot. And then after that, sometimes you'll hear them put in like a secondary dominant. So instead of just 1, you might hear. So they'll play like little things like that. That's one thing I noticed was a big one. And then probably the biggest thing I've noticed beyond harmony, beyond, repetition of chords, is this thing where they play behind the beat. Another name you might hear it, if you look at some people talking about it, they will call it slugging it or something like that. But they'll play it like just behind the beat, where if it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, you might hear. You hear this sort of like, it's purposefully done, but it doesn't sound off. It doesn't sound like if someone comes in a half beat late in a Mahler symphony, you can tell, okay, that person messed up. They're not going to have that chair anymore. It's just wrong. Exactly.
Unintentional solo.
If someone comes in too early and anything like that, you can hear it right away. But someone just playing some progression. It's just this sort of... one of my biggest problems is trying to find a technical term that someone would really want to see in the theory book, but Yeah,
push and pull going on there.
And it keeps you off balance, but it feels good at the same time. It feels comfortable. It's that comfortability and that. But I mean, a lot of tonal music, I was telling my students, is that at least when we talk about tonal music, it's a system that we're comfortable hearing as opposed to post-tonal music, where it's built on asymmetry. Like if you look at a symmetrical scale, it doesn't sound that pleasing to the ear. But then you look at a major scale, it's not symmetrical, but it feels more at home than something that. But then you look at the structure of the music. A lot of times we build in symmetry and all this. So yeah, that neo-soul, R&B sort of thing, those are like three things that I would say I've been able to kind of like parse out from the music that was separated. Now I said this in the presentation, that I saw a source that said John Legend is a neo-soul artist. I've never heard him do any of those things that I mentioned. If he did, maybe it's in a live performance. He might do the harmony thing, revoice something. But yeah, I would not classify. I don't think anybody would classify him as a neo-soul artist. But
yeah, I heard him talk, and he didn't classify himself.
Not at all. So
live.
Yeah,
so.
It's just this weird thing that sometimes people lump people in those categories. But I would say if you look out for those like hallmarks in a lot of recordings, you can hear it done in Erykah Badu. You can hear it done in D'Angelo's music. You can hear it done in the music of her. Some Summer Walker stuff. You know, they kind of go in and out. Some pieces by Jill Scott, that's another one. They will sound like more commercial R&B or closer to that, and sometimes they will sound very much like an independent R&B artist on the same album. So sometimes I'm not so sure if the distinction between the two is as important or pertinent to the discussion of what are they doing within the larger tradition of R&B. Yeah.
Right.
Sure. But we're music theorists. That's what we do. We create
categories,
definitions, and we separate things out, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the phrase model kind of idea that we're often presented with in the classical traditions, and how that model maybe doesn't work so well when you started analyzing these musics.
Yeah. So I would start off by saying more than likely most tonal music has a 5-1 sort of feeling to it. It has a moment where you get to a 5 and then it resolves to its 1. It's a very clear marker, because as I also tell my freshmen, yes, we're learning this way of how music was created, and we're seeing how it kind of changed over time. But if you want to think about the tonal realm, the best way to establish tonic is not 1 to 4 to 1. The most definitive way is to have that 5-1, right? So if you put 4-1, it sounds ambiguous, because 1 can be without a 7th on any of them, they sound like 1 to 4, or it can sound like 4 to 1, like C to F, for example. But putting in that 5 chord gives you that. So we look at a lot of music through this lens. We look at it, okay, what types of cadences can we have? All of our cadences are named after this sort of design. During the presentation I showed that if we look at the names of cadences, perfect authentic or authentic cadence means that we went through this phrase model 5-1, half cadence, we cut it in half. Deceptive, 5 didn't go to 1. So all of these sorts of things are the what we call the phrase model, this 1 to something, and then the phrase or the piece ends 5-1, solidifies that. So my thing was like, my dissertation is on contemporary gospel music, and one of the things I'm looking at is the concept of the subdominant and how that kind of reigns supreme over the dominant. And it's almost like a reverse phrase model, where we're going backwards in this progression. We're going into the 4, because that's the dominant, the inverted dominant, I guess you can call it. So if I'm looking at a bunch of music that ends 4-1, or ends with a 5-1, but there's a 4-1 plagal cadence at the end, and I had my students, they actually unprompted started to discuss this and debate it, whether or not it was a plagal cadence or an authentic cadence. Like you look at the textbooks like Kaplan and others, they talk about the plagal cadence. This is just this it's a tag at the end of something. But if it happens in so much, contemporary gospel music or a lot of religious pieces that I've looked at, how can we just say, okay, all these things are just adding the same tag after everything? It has to be more significant than that. So, that idea of having 1 to 4 as a relationship, or having that be emphasized in certain cultures or certain groups, means that if we try to plug these things in, like some jazz pieces, they might not end with a 5 one. They might end with a tritone sub or something like that. Yes, the tritone substitution is a substitution for the dominant, but then again, you don't actually have 5. And if we look at that as imaginary 5 or something and say it's really a 5, in terms of like if you make a Shankergraph or something, you could say that there's technically like an invisible 5 that you can't hear or something. And we try to put all this other stuff, and it's like the hoops that people jump through to kind of, pigeonhole this stuff in, trying to find descending lines in the music and these jazz pieces that it doesn't exist, trying to do all this stuff. And it's like, why not just look at, and that gets into what I was talking about when I say look at the music on its own terms. We look at post-tonal music like that. We don't say, okay, everything is going to have a tone row. We know that this tone row might be the language of some. We know a time point system might be the language of some. Derived rows, derived series, 5-note rows. We have all these things, set theory. And when we look at tonal music, it's like all of a sudden, no, we have this one thing. It has to look at it. We have to look at it like this. And somehow it's like almost like a deformation or something we're taking away, as opposed to just looking at it. Because it is tricky, right? We look at music that is tonal. How do we know it's tonal if we've been told all this time all the music that came before it, even within jazz or other traditions, does 5-1? How do we make sense of something that we know, just like the progression I was playing 1 to 4, it sounds tonal, period. So how do we make sense of that? And that's why I said I advocate for like contextual analysis or contextual tonal analysis, where we look at it in and of itself. What is it doing? Now, of course, as theorists, we want to come up with things that are more universal. But again, within that tradition, it's like we have notes. We know they can belong to keys. And I feel like that's it. As far as the phrase model is really like almost like a form sort of thing. And if you put everything in terms of a form, it's not really so much harmonic as much as it's that, at least to me. So if we put it in that sort of box, you lose a lot in translation if we're just looking for that. Like pieces that end on 4, pieces that end on 2-1, something like that. You lose a lot in your analysis if you try to just look at it through this sort of lens.
No, totally. I am supervising a project right now on Korean music with one of my students, and we just talking about closure, and it's funny, like even an undergraduate, that like they're so almost used to looking at everything through that lens that I'm like, get rid of the lens, like like you have to like almost purposefully like take out the lens so you can actually look at the music, as you say, contextually, like on its own terms, and just talk about closure in this music's terms. And it's really hard because it also requires like an investment on my part. I'm not an expert on Korean music, so I have to like then put in the time to really, really figure out, well, what is this music's own terms? And like, that requires a lot of investment on all of our parts, as analysts.
Yeah. I heard one of my professors, actually, Professor Marvin, we were in a meeting, and she mentioned like, this is something we need to do. And she understands also that one of the biggest issues is inertia. Like, we've been used to doing it a certain way for so long. So people have examples after examples lined up to teach an augmented 6th chord. But how many times have we used, like I've been teaching augmented 6th chord, how many times we use It Don't Mean a Thing, the Duke Ellington, or even like some Disney music sometimes. But where we see all this stuff happening, it's like, how many times do we go outside of the tradition? And I don't even think it's necessarily laziness, but I think it's laziness when it comes to searching out that stuff, because those same people, not including Professor Marvin, but some people that's more hesitant about going out and really doing that kind of work, it's like you have to get into a whole different mindset in order to be able to really make sense of all of these harmonies, all this stuff, because now you're dealing with something that it doesn't embody that framework anymore. Like, how do you do that? Years and years of teaching and learning and just growing within one tradition. How do you basically break outside of that? You just do it, honestly. Turn on the radio sometimes, open up a fake book, just go through it the same way. I feel like if you can look through, 500 pages or 500 measures of a Mahler symphony to find a form, I feel like you can look through a few lead sheets to find something, or listen to a few songs on XM radio or something like that, just to find something. That worked for me. I was mainly classical, and I told my students, theory didn't really become that meaningful to me. It was always something I loved to do, but it didn't become that meaningful to me until I stepped outside classical music. So when I was in the practice rooms at Howard and I would hear people playing jazz or improvising or making up these chord progressions, doing neo-soul progressions, things like that. And all those years of classical training did not help me figure out what was going on. Same thing you talked about, Paul, about looking at what the guy was doing on the Pretty Simple Music video. And it's like, what does all this training and all this technical jargon, what does that really get you when it comes to like wider range of interest? It's like you have to go out and search for that.
Yeah, you got to go on YouTube. And by the way, Richard, if you ever think about doing some YouTube videos on keyboard chords, I would definitely watch them.
Okay. Hopefully somebody
does. I think that you bring up a great point in that we're looking at these students, and these students are looking back at us and asking, why is this meaningful, right? Why should I bother learning this? And I've had students ask me in class, like, why do we have to learn this, right? Or what? Like, I have to learn secondary dominance. And so you have to kind of think about, well, why is it meaningful? It's not just meaningful because I say it's meaningful. That doesn't that doesn't fly. It never did, and it certainly is not now with the students that we have now who are asking these types of tough questions. And so, how do you kind of make maybe we can talk about these R&B and Neo-Soul songs, for example. How do you use those songs in your classroom? Is there certain lessons or topics that you find work well in bringing these musics in that your students are more familiar with?
Okay, so I would say a lot of times I start with the gospel tradition. Howard has a big gospel choir. The school is predominantly African American, so I can bring in those things, and I know that they'll recognize it. But I also make sure they know that I will bring in, Schubert. I will bring in Nirvana, whatever it is, because it's like I don't want to just that you need to only study black music. But seeing as how black music has basically given rise to a lot of popular music forms out there, we could probably say most of them, it's like, we need to really, pay attention to the contributions and celebrate this music. So sometimes what I do is, like, if I'm looking at an example, for instance, I was looking at the Summer Walker has a song, Playing Games, where London on the track is a producer. So it has these sorts of like chord progressions, and let's make sure I have the right voicing here. So it's in B minor, and then you get to this minor 5, and then this 6, and then this 4. So there's some times when you get before the G chord, and before the E minor chord, you get this dominant 7 flat 5 built on B. You get this. So you get that 2 times, and it's basically the same sort of harmony. It's some type of B dominant 7 chord. Well, when we're talking about 2 things, one, tonicizations, I can bring that up. And then later in the semester, I can bring that up when we start talking about taking fully diminished 7 chords and reinterpreting them as some other thing because they have 4 different leading tones. We think about Schoenberg's quote about fully diminished 7 chords being vagrant harmonies, like they can go anywhere. So the way that he used, because he actually uses the same producer in an EP a year later, he used the same sort of framework where he's taken a chord that can be reinterpreted as something else. So if we look at a B, for instance, a B dominant 7 flat 9, we take away the B, it's a fully diminished 7 chord. Well, that D sharp can tonicize E, or we can look at the F sharp now as tonicizing G. So if we look at just that harmony, It can go to E minor. If we look at it and put the F sharp on the bottom, it can resolve to that G. And then now B is something that is fundamental to one harmony, and then it becomes some extra note, some type of non-chord tone, and something else. So yeah, just having those students and not just looking at one piece and saying, okay, we're just going to look at it in that way. I try to parse out everything that they're learning and try to bring it into different discussions. So if we're talking about common tone diminished seven chords, or reinterpreting diminished seven chords as having the other notes as being the root of the chord, potential leading tones, I try to do things like that. Or there's a lament bass is another example, and this is something I will probably, bring more into the fray later on in their semester or their music theory sequence. But it's a song, Misunderstood, where the entire bass line is basically the same thing that you learn in any sort of tonal theory class, where you have this line. So when you hear that 1 to 5 stepwise motion, you might want to hear it as like, or, and then we teach it that way. We want to hear it, but when he does it, first he gives you a 7th chord, really an 11, and then it goes to. So you get all these sorts of different harmonies. And that is really where I really deviate away from the sort of like the general tried and true paradigm of how you teach these things. I feel like once a student really understands fundamentals, diatonicism, and I mean they know it like the back of their hand, they understand it like this, like it's their alphabets. Mm-hmm. If they get that, most troubles that students have beyond the second half or the second part of the freshman year will be gone. But most of the time, even if they have, they can do it, that speed at which they're able to do that. Imagine if a student in 5th grade was still having trouble spelling the word dog. Well, we do that with a lot of students for sophomore years. Like, we don't really hone in on the fact they don't have that dexterity when it comes to fundamentals. So when I want to teach a student that progression, that from the Lucky Days Misunderstood, so if I want to teach them something like that, one, I teach them lament bass, great, they know it diatonically. But how do I explain how he uses those inner harmonies? How do I explain how he goes from an E minor 9 to a E flat major 9? How do I explain that to them? If I say, okay, one exercise I do is, here's a note, A, or I don't know, D sharp or D flat. All right. How many chords can you think of that uses that? How many sus chords can you think of? How many 1 chords, 4 chords? How many minor triads, minor 7 chords, being the 7th of a chord, being the 9th of a chord? How many chords can you think of that just... So all of those harmonies that just use that one note, and having students do that sort of exercise, sometimes once a week or something like that, I try to have them do that. Reharmonize hot cross buns, little things like that. Just try to think of how many chords can you think of, and that's what goes back to that video you were talking about at the top of the talk. That's really what they're doing. They're trying to think. They're thinking functionally. They're thinking functionally, but they're also thinking of how many different chords can you, how many different chords can you incorporate into this just using that one note? Yeah. So yeah, it's a lot that goes into it, but it's like as I go along, I will make sure I bring in pieces multiple times to kind of express different sort of functions within it.
It makes me think of like the E minor Chopin prelude. It's all about linear voice leading, and I mean, I'm thinking I have your PowerPoint here pulled up and looking at the Misunderstood. Yeah,
that one.
Yeah, exactly. You're right, and it's all about this same note or similar notes, but reharmonize, and you have those same types of linear voice leadings happening in this neo-soul music as well.
Definitely. And that was something a friend of mine told me, that Ben Baker, who wrote a really great paper, he looked at a cyclic approach to Robert Glasper's music. If you ever get a chance, check out that article. I think it's in Theory and Analysis, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, he told me that, while I was giving a talk, someone, mentioned like the concept of planing or something, where you can keep like sliding, or you keep a voice and you do all these things. And I think that's a great part to it, is to notice that there's sort of this linear voice lead, and there's one voice and there's other things happening below it. Or you can look at it as possibly having not just the linear voice leading aspect, but you also have other things that's going on beneath that with regards to the general harmony. It's a tricky thing, right? Because you have this sort of music that doesn't adhere to these principles, but it uses the same sort of framework, like a lament, a bass lament, a chromatic descent. It's things that you normally don't associate with happy sounds, happy music, anything like that. So we can still connect these ideas, but I think it takes work. Like I said at the beginning, it takes like looking for this stuff and not saying, well, it doesn't sound like the way, these other composers did it. So, put this in the appendix. It's like, no, it works. It just works differently. That's why I said, look at it on its own terms. Even if you don't look at the word lament, it is still a descending bass line that goes down to fourth and it comes back up to the same note. We can analyze the lyrics. We can talk about those things. That's a good thing about a lot of popular music. We can talk about the content of the songs as well. Same way we do with Schubert Lieder. It's there. Exactly.
I think one of the best things that happened to me in my teaching career is that several years ago, Paul was teaching our jazz theory class, and he got a full-time job and moved on. And I ended up over a few semesters, I ended up needing to take over that class. We just couldn't find someone who was the right fit to teach it. And I finally was like, I'll do it for one semester. And until we can, get someone hired in. And Ben is laughing right now because he knows that I have now taught that class something like 16 times. And I love it. And it's one of my, I do. And it's one of my favorite classes that I teach, but nothing has taught me more than that class, because I had loved jazz my whole life, but I had never really studied it. And one of the first things that I did was sit down and basically analyze the real book, just lead sheet after lead sheet. And I discovered it's got a lot of the same tricks as, traditional tonal music, but it also has its own language, its own way of doing things, its own way of going from key to key, its own set of kind of typical relationships and what you're going to expect to see. And being immersed in that has really helped me go back and teach the other stuff. It kind of has worked the other way around. Definitely. And that's the best way, I think. I'm so glad that I ended up agreeing to that one semester and then, getting to live with that music for a much longer period of time. It's been great.
Yeah, I totally agree. My latest thing has been listening to Lord Kitsch, who's one of the founders of Steel Pan in Trinidad. And I was just in my office hour and I was introducing one of my students to Lord Kitsch. I was like, this is Lord Kitsch. And I said, sometimes it's hard to get scores for steel pan music. And then I was like, honestly, for lots of marginalized composers, it's really difficult to get a lot of the scores or even recordings, And my student was like, what do you mean by marginalized composers? And I was just like, well, where do I start? I was just like, there's so much, and it's like sometimes there's not even awareness of like the fact that certain groups, certain musics are being marginalized. There's not even an awareness of that. And I thought that was just mind blowing for me, like that moment, it was just crazy.
Especially when the music is such a big part of a cultural group's existence. I think music, period, no matter where you go, is a big part. But yeah, to open up a theory book and to not see a lot of this stuff in there. It might be hard to put a song that has just like one bass note the entire song. It might be hard to, talk about that and to really spend a whole chunk of class doing that. But it's still a worthwhile experience to acknowledge the existence of it and to acknowledge the existence of a bunch of other things out there. And it, like I said, it doesn't even just have to be, I look at R&B, neo-soul, gospel music, but it can be anything else. It can be Haitian compa, it can be salsa, merengue, it can be reggae, it can be Peking opera. Like, it's a bunch of other things that people get into. Like, I've never been the biggest fan of rock or anything like that, but there's a lot of music out there. Some songs I have, and I actually enjoy listening to them. Maybe not the entire genre as a whole, but yeah, there's things out there. It's just like you said, Jennifer, it takes that first step of actually just going out and saying, okay, I want to get outside my comfort zone and actually try that. Because the first time you get up, especially if you aren't, let's say you aren't a black person and you're teaching theory and you want to bring in a Cardi B example, or you want to bring in some other artist, and you might not feel comfortable the first time you do that. Doesn't mean you can't bring that example in. Maybe some lyrics you might not be able to say and things like that, but just period, being able to jump outside the box. Even for myself, if I bring in salsa or something like that, it might not be something that I am the most well versed in, but it is something I can at least acknowledge and talk about it, again, on its own terms. And when I say that, a lot of times if it's tonal music, it's probably going to have some characteristics that we've seen before. So when the music doesn't do 5-1, it avoids, oftentimes that's probably like a fourth characteristic from the question earlier of what happens with a lot of this music and R&B and neo-soul. It's almost like this avoidance of 5. Like purposefully, and when you go backwards in terms of not the phrase model, but just starting on 1 and not going up thirds. If you go backwards thirds, you go to 6, you go to 4, you go to 2, and you have to basically keep doing that in order to get to 5. And by the time you've gotten a few thirds back, it's just like, okay, we can just work with this sort of third. And if you ever get a chance to see again Ben Baker's paper where he shows how we can kind of build like a cycle. It's the 3-4 cycle, or the IC 3-4, and you basically just, I don't want to get too in the weeds with this.
This is a podcast about theory and theory pedagogy. You can nerd out as much as you want.
Okay, cool. So the alternating 3-4 cycles, basically think of a minor third, major third. So if you basically do that, and you'll basically get back around to, like, so they started on 0. We could look at it as pitch classes. You'll have 24 pitch class by the time you're finished. And you'll have a series of, I always looked at it, and I bring it up because I was looking at Robert Glasper's music as mainly functioning as, like, he'll have a progression that's like, so basically it's A minor, F sharp minor, and then D minor. So if we're looking at that, we might look at that F sharp minor chord as being borrowed from the major, which is not one that we normally talk about when we talk about modal mixture. We always talk about minor chords being inputted into the major rather than the other way around. And it's for a good reason. Sometimes, like, it sounds a lot of times like it's modal, like the Avengers theme. So it sounds more like it's Dorian sometimes than it does anything else. Whereas a major piece, so that minor 4, it doesn't really give you a feeling of being modal.
Yep. Koji Kondo does that a lot too with the Dorian sound. Koji Kondo.
Oh yeah, Koji Kondo. I'm sorry. It's that sort of sound. It's just trying to figure out what's going on in that. So going back to the concept of thirds, if we look at that as 1 going to sharp 6 minor, going to minor 4, which is diatonic to the original key we started in, we could also look at those if we build 7th chords, A, C, E, C, E, G, and then after that, if we kind of like shift that, we can get F sharp, A, C sharp, E, and we retain those 2 of the notes from the other chord. And if we looked at it in terms of that cycle, it would have been A or E, C, A, F, D. But if we shift those notes around it, we get, instead of we can get that sound. And I think he calls it a slide because it, you know, by building these thirds out, it's almost like you shift every other one up or down a half step. So instead of getting, which you wouldn't get if you just went around that circle, you have to kind of shift things. So that's a lot to bring up in the middle of a theory class, that sort of way of looking at it. But it is, I like this model because what it does is, when you get into the article, it really accounts for how we get, at least Robert Glasper, how he gets his melodic lines, improvisational lines, because he shows how this sort of structure gives you upper extensions. And if you move by thirds, you get a lot of common tones. Yeah. So that sort of idea, just bringing that back into the fray when we're trying to look at how these harmonies sort of work together. And yeah, it's so much out there where we could talk about this stuff for hours, and then someone else will come up with another 2 chord progression tomorrow, and it's like we could sit there and do that all day long. So
right.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of we're in the midst of all this creation. You know, that's one of the benefits of analyzing Mozart. It's like we have history to kind of help us. It's not being done right in the moment. And so, but that's also really exciting, you know, to think that we can be analyzing these musics that are happening, that are doing new things all the time. I wanted to kind of touch also on something that you mentioned in your bio, is that one of your kind of goals as a professional and your personal life is to make music theory more accessible to and inclusive of people of color. So there are kind of 2 parts of that kind of statement. There's the accessibility and the inclusiveness. And so could you talk a little bit about kind of those 2 kind of streams in your statement there?
Yeah, so it was someone, I can't remember his name, it was Michael something, but he was the head of NAFME up until 2015 or 2016. And during a board meeting or some type of meeting, again, this is NAFME, he said that they made a remark about the board not having any black members or anything like that. And he, you know, said something offhand that was already problematic enough about how they don't make the list, people vote them in or something like that. But then he said that he made a comment about saying that blacks and Latinos normally aren't good at theory and they don't have keyboard skills and things like that. And then when he got called out on it, he kind of doubled down and got upset. And then eventually, like all people in those positions, he had to resign. So it was just this general idea. When we talk about accessibility, there's this idea outside of our own communities where it's like, okay, those people don't do theory because they don't look like the people who make classical music, right? So even though the music is very good, it's, you know, great music, whether it's gospel or merengue, anything like that, a lot of those traditions aren't written down. That is something that is a thing. It's not written down. Does it mean that it doesn't use these chords and these melodic structures, these formal structures? No, it just means that the way it's codified is not the same way that we look at it with Haydn Symphony or something. So when it comes to the first part of that, when I say accessibility, making sure those people have access to it, making sure those people have access to music theory courses or just talking about the stuff in there, not to say, okay, you need this in order to validate your music, because I even put that in the beginning of my dissertation proposal defense, that me talking about gospel music is not to legitimize it. It's just there so we can at least make it part of these discussions when it comes to music theory. Really, it's to legitimize music theory if we wanted to really look at it like that, because right now it is very limited as far as its scope. So having more people come, not just more people, but having it be more welcoming. I guess that gets into the inclusion, the accessibility and inclusion part, and not just saying like, okay, we're going to have, you know, we don't have enough black faculty members teaching theory. You can have, if we make all of them black, that's not going to solve anything because they're going to be teaching the same stuff. So that's why it's kind of broken up into multiple parts. There's levels to it because, yeah, a lot of times when we talk about diversity and things like that, we're talking about diversifying the people who participate in the tradition rather than diversifying the actual tradition or our approach to that thing, which is basically music. So when we go into a classroom, having not just, you know, an extra Sammy Coleridge Taylor example, which would be great. But that's not the only thing that we need to do. We know have him, have Florence Price, have a bunch of other black composers, William Levi Dawson, a bunch of them, Grant Still. But also, what about the things that happen outside of classical tradition? The things that aren't readily perceptible because they aren't on paper. Doing those things so when students come in, they see themselves. Because I was just watching something about NCAA women's basketball and that whole scandal and everything with the workout room. And they started talking about how when young girls started to see themselves more and more in college sports, you start to see an uptick in the amount of young girls wanting to actually participate in those sports. So it's the same thing with mostly everything else. If you don't see yourself in that position, you don't really know like it's possible for you to do that, and you don't feel like it's valued. And the last part of it is that I feel like the more sinister thing that happens when we start to exclude people from this, or we look at people as if they aren't capable or smart enough, because that's basically what they're saying a lot of times, that music theory is on this pedestal, and if you can't do it, then the music isn't sophisticated or something. What happens is, beyond that being wrong, is that people in these very same communities, because I've heard this when I was a student at Howard, is like music theory isn't for us, that we aren't capable of doing that. And when those very same communities start to believe these stereotypes, I believe that's the worst part, because you can solve all the problems and get these people out of these positions of power and do everything. But if a whole contingent of people believe that their whole cultural group isn't smart enough or worthy enough of this sort of study or to be able to do something on this level, that to me is probably the worst part of most of that stuff. So trying to shift that narrative and bring more people into the fray when it comes not just to the examples we give, but the people who is teaching the stuff, the types of music we study, everything is super important.
That's awesome. That's great. I teach at a women's university, and so like thinking about women, examples by women, and even having a theory textbook we use the Clendenny Marvin, authored by two women, like this is for you too. Yeah. Like it's not just just for white guys. This has been wonderful talking with you, Richard. Before we kind of finish up though, we like to do a little kind of rapid fire kind of question session with our guests, and this is a question that you have not been prompted on, so just kind of off the cuff question, off the cuff response. Jen, do you want to go first?
Sure. Favorite topic to teach in written theory?
Ooh. Maybe common tone diminished seven chords.
All right.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
Yeah, people are always afraid of those.
That's a first. Nobody's ever said that.
People are always afraid of those.
So
I found that I put it on PowerPoints like this is the most terrifying chord in music theory. Students hate trying to parse it out, but yeah, I really like getting into it and see students' reaction when they finally figure out what's going on.
Awesome. All right, I'll go. This is one I do all the time. 164 or 564?
164.
All right.
Yay. Yeah. That's me too.
We can recognize 164 because it's funny, we do that with 564 to 53, but we don't do it for passing 6/4s. Granted,
or pedal 6/4s.
Yeah, and I get it. Passing 6/4s doesn't hold the bass, so of course we don't like cadential 6/4s. Really, like we look at it as prolonged and dominant, blah blah blah. But it is two distinct harmonies. Yeah, you lose I feel like you gain something in that, but you also lose something in that. So yeah.
All right, and then Ben.
All right, I'm asking for one piece of advice to a beginning music theory teacher. Somebody's about to walk in, first class. What do you tell them?
Wow. Be open-minded. Be very, very open-minded. I think when you do that for the first time, it's easy to fall into a routine. You open up a textbook, a workbook, you put out some worksheets, things like that. But sometimes you might throw out a lesson in the middle of it. I've done that in the past, and they've been great lessons afterwards. So, yeah, be very, very not flexible, but comfortable in that flexibility to know that when you throw those things out, you can just riff and talk with some students. Maybe you might not get anything done that day, but you'll gain something in that discussion and what you learn about yourself and your students through that. So yeah, just be very comfortable and open-minded to know that that textbook is not God.
There we go. That's a tweet right there. The textbook is not God. I like that.
I love it.
So as we kind of wrapping up, maybe we can close with letting us know some of the projects or things you're working on. And then you mentioned that you're not on any social media, but if someone wants to find you, and if you want, of course, to be found, how could someone find you?
They can find me through my email address, honestly. My friends are trying to push me into creating social media, whether it's a YouTube channel, Instagram page, or anything, but still reluctant on doing that. But they can reach me at my email address. Right now, it is R as in Richard, and it's my last name. So RD as in Delta, ESIN as in November, ORD as in Delta @gmail.com. If anyone wants to reach out or talk about anything music theory related, I actually got a couple people that have been emailing me since that talk. So, yeah.
So that's our show. Thank you so much for listening to Note Doctors, the Music Theory and Pedagogy podcast. We'll be back with more interviews with professors and teachers who will be dropping all sorts of theory knowledge for your education, edification, and enjoyment. So until then, bye-bye.